I'm Alan Matisow, Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to this evening's event, which is a lecture by John Zogby. I know Ambassador Drigian wanted to be here and regrets very much that he's in Paris. He and Mr. Zogby have worked closely together. Most recently, Mr. Zogby was a member of the Advisory Group on Public Diplomacy for the Arab and Muslim World, which Ambassador Drigian chaired, beginning in 2003. And they collaborated on a report that was well publicized and we hope has a significant influence in the conduct of American public diplomacy. I guess we could say that Mr. Zogby is, in a way, a colleague of mine since he began his career as a history professor and a liberal activist in Utica, New York. He was active enough, actually, to run for mayor of Utica in 1981. And during that campaign, his students conducted a poll to see how he was doing, and they predicted he would get 15% of the vote. And unfortunately for Mr. Zogby, they were right on the money. After that, John Zogby, whose parents are Lebanese immigrants, went to work for a Arab-American activist group, left that in 1984 and became a political consultant. Got his feet wet in the polling business in 1987 when he conducted a poll for the town of Watertown, is that right? It was still a very small operation and did some more local polling. In 1991, he graduated to state polls and got his big break in 1996 when Reuters gave him a contract to poll for the presidential election of that year. All the experts were predicting that President Clinton would defeat Bob Dole by double digits. Zogby International predicted that the victory would be only in the range of 8%, and he hit it almost precisely and became famous, and his company became hot. He called it right in 2000, called it right in 2004. Today, Zogby International has a large roster of clients from the corporate world, the media world, the political world, and it is become a major institution. Last year, John Zogby was quoted as saying, "I want to be the Gallup of my generation, the household word, the generic." Mr. Zogby actually is well on the way to fulfilling that ambition. And so would you welcome Mr. Zogby to the
Wow, that's nicer than the bio I wrote for myself. Thank you. You know, you never forget the early days, and I love to tell this story. It's 100% true, that I started this business in 1984. I just sort of backed into it and was able to start it with a few very, very nice and fat consulting clients, one of whom died 10 weeks into my contract right before Christmas. And I remember calling my wife and saying, I have 997 business cards left in this box that say John Zogby and Associates, and of course there were no associates. What on earth do I do now? And so I started networking. I started calling everybody I knew, visiting everybody I knew, marketing myself, telling them I was available. And I ran into an old buddy of mine at a Friday happy hour, someone I'd gone to high school with. And I told him what I was doing. And I said, please spread the word. And so apparently he did, because Monday morning I got into the office and the telephone rang. And it was his aunt. And she said to me, "You're a pollster?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, I have a sofa and a chair, and I need to have it." I want you to know I did that sofa and chair. We needed it. It was right before Christmas. I'm going to talk to you about where we are as a nation today. I'm not going to make any predictions for the future. I don't do that. Just going to describe where we're at today, where I see us. And then at the tail end, I'd also like to share with you a little bit about some of the global polling that we've been doing, getting some fascinating results in the Middle East in particular. But we are, as a nation today, split, hopelessly right in half. We are reds and we are blues. And we've been split before. Know anything about American history? In fact, many of the divisions that we have today, we had right through our history, and they reached boiling points at various points in our history. The 20s is certainly a good example, the 60s certainly another. But the difference between where we are now and where we have been in the past is that in every other period, we had what the historians James McGregor Burns and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. once referred to as the vital center. There was always anywhere from 28 to 35% of the electorate who were right in the middle, who offered a kind of creative play between the two extremes. And because of that buffer, one side or the other side was able to move some of that vital center over into a majority, create critical mass, allow the two extremes to kind of talk to each other and ultimately negotiate with each other. Policy was made, crises were averted, wars ended, and so on. The difficulty today is that that vital center is missing. That in fact, as early as March of 2004, astoundingly, when we polled on the presidential race and it was clear it was going to be Kerry versus Bush, we only had 5% of the likely voters tell us that they were undecided. Normally, in March of an election year, I'll have 25% undecided. Frankly, going into the last week of an election, I still normally have 10% undecided, and then it starts to drop. But here we were already divided not only into two camps, but two hostile camps. And so a few months before that, I had been referring to the election of 2004 as the Armageddon election. And I described it in that way simply because we were not only so polarized, but that neither side was talking to each other. And in one prediction that I made that was accurate, I said, in fact, whichever side wins this election, especially if it's close, there will be substantial numbers of the other side who will not accept the legitimacy of the election. Now, not cry foul, not be angry and upset, not be disillusioned, not bury their heads in the sand, but actually, literally, deny the legitimacy of the election. What do I mean when I say we're hopelessly polarized? We did a poll, December of 2003. And we did it as we normally do, testing a lot of policies, but attaching to each policy alternative a value, a core value. Voters may vote one way or the other. Voters may change their minds on who they like or dislike based on personalities, but values seldom change. And basically, we did this poll, and then when we were done with it, we took this purely artificial construct, red states those that voted for Bush in 2000, and blue states, those who voted for Gore in 2000. And I say it was a purely artificial construct because you know, I mean, New Hampshire was a red state back then. Only 7,000 votes made it red. And Florida, God knows what happened in Florida, 500 votes, 534 votes. Bush won. That made it a red state, while New Mexico, where the margin was even smaller, became a blue state. And Oregon and Wisconsin and the state of Washington, very close. But here we were, reds and blues. But we took this construct and we cross-tabulated the data, reds versus blues. Listen to what we found. In the red states, 55% of the voters told us they attend a place of worship at least once a week. 55%. In the blue states, it was 31%. That's a 24-point difference. And I might add, that's an important voter barometric reading. Those who attend a place of worship most often tend to vote more conservative. Now, both reds and blues told us that they want their president to believe in God. It was 75% of the red state voters, and it was 51% of the blue state voters, majority, but still that 24-point differential. How do you define that God? The overwhelming majority of red state voters told us that that God is defined in terms of a God of justice. A God who represents the ultimate good against the ultimate evil. Morally absolutist terms in the red states. While in the blue states, the overwhelming majority, well over 70%, told us that they defined that God as a God of love and as a God who was more morally relative. Morality writ small in the terms of sociologist Alan Wolf. Live and let live. Huge differences. 61% of red state voters told us that they keep a gun. 35% of blue state voters told us they keep a gun. One huge differential that we discovered early on was that there was not going to be much of a gender gap. And as you know, there wasn't. But the real gap in American politics is the marriage gap. Married voters tend to be much more conservative than single, never married voters. And what we discovered was that you were 7 points more likely to be married and living with your spouse in the red states than you were in the blue states. And that for that matter, younger voters there was a tendency to find more of a clustering of younger voters in the blue states than in the red states. There were other barometric readings that we utilized. One that intrigued me, we were a part, all of us, in defining that so-called NASCAR dads phenomenon, which was very real. But you were many points more likely to be a participant or an active fan in local sports like Little League and high school football or college basketball in your hometown, much more likely in the red states than in the blue states. And there was a clear demarcation in terms of how those local sports fans voted. They tended to be more Republican and conservative than in the blue states. And so, very simply, we had clear cultural differences, clear demographic differences, clear behavioral differences between the reds and the blues. And the red states and the blue states were still this artificial construct. And so, what always amazed me was how both political parties jumped on this demarcation. And instead of offering a bridge, as parties normally do and as presidential candidates normally do, what you clearly had were both presidential candidates, both political parties, shaping their program and their platform and their public statements and their public persona, with the president speaking to the Reds and Senator Kerry speaking to the Blues. Now, there were times that Senator Kerry tried to jump over to the other side using the wrong message. Clearly, what we saw all year was that if the campaign were fought on the economy, if it were fought on health care, if it were fought on the environment, if it were fought on Social Security, if it were fought on the war in Iraq, Kerry had a huge advantage on all of those issues. If the campaign were fought instead on Homeland Security, on the war on terrorism, Bush not only had an advantage, he had a 35, 38-point advantage on that issue. So the one issue that Kerry utilized in an effort to jump over and appeal to the other side was the wrong issue. As soon as he went up to his convention in July, a time when a presidential nominee seeks to speak to his own base, define his own base, coalesce his own base, and harden it, that was the time that Kerry decided to salute and say, I'm your commander-in-chief in waiting, and I'm signing up for duty. It was the wrong message. He immediately tried to fight the campaign on Bush's turf, and there was no way that he was going to win. And ultimately, he became minced meat when the Swift boat veterans leveled their charges, produced their ads, and Kerry was windsurfing somewhere, which you'll find a lot more in the blue states, incidentally, than you will in the red states. That was one of the local sports. So, let's talk about the president. You can't argue with success. He's in the midst of his second term, and he won. But I have to admit that he defied all of the traditional rules of the game. You normally get the nomination on the right, and you win the war, the campaign, in the center. This president, right from day one, never defined for himself a centrist strategy. Karl Rove, the genius, laid out for the president a strategy for 4 years that called simply for the president to consolidate that base and keep it solid. And it worked. And in fact, I have to be honest with you, I'm one of the people who thought that it wouldn't work. In fact, I likened the president's first term by using the metaphor of the bouncing rubber ball. Basically, the president came into office 48-48. After his inaugural address, he was at 51-46. Normally, presidents get a huge bounce after an inaugural address. And then they use the first 100 days when the press leaves them alone. They have a honeymoon. They use that to build and consolidate a governing majority. This president, right from the get-go, decided instead, number one, that he was going to oppose federal funding for NGOs, non-governmental organizations overseas, that either distribute condoms or preach family planning and so on, alienating many centrist soccer mom kinds of voters. Secondly, the president laid out for himself an environmental policy that alienated centrist and suburban voters, and his numbers went down among independents, among centrists, among moderates, among suburbanites. Some of the last-minute Clinton executive orders that regulated more strongly the presence of carbon dioxide emissions in the air and arsenic levels in drinking water. President Bush rescinded those. And so by the end of the first 100 days, in my polling, the president was at 48. In fact, the president was at 49 positive and 50 negative early September 2001. In other words, one of those pundits, talking heads, was saying that the president had squandered an opportunity to build a governing majority by appealing to centrist voters. And then 9/11 happened. And that's where I used the bouncing rubber ball. Because take a rubber ball, go out in the middle of the street, bounce it as hard as you can, and your first bounce is a very large bounce. And that's what the president got. In my polling, 86% positive rating. A negligible negative rating. In fact, it was a high positive rating across the board by everyone. Americans were not only rallying around their leader, they were bonding with each other. They were actually seeking out their familiar institutions to give them some sort of stability. So numbers on organized religion went up. More people, America was always a religious nation, but more people were going to church. More people were getting active in their neighborhood. More people were attending neighborhood watch meetings. Both political parties' numbers shot up. Presidents did too. But I did some polling in September, about the third week, fourth week of September. President's numbers were very high. We asked voters, do you support or oppose the war on terrorism? 91% supported the war on terrorism. But we asked, what if the war on terrorism were to last 6 months to a year? The 91% went down to 77%. What if the war on terrorism were to last a year to 2 years? Numbers went down to 66% support. What if it were to last more than 2 years? The numbers went down to 57%. And very simply what happened were two things. Number one, I learned that Americans were still very much in the midst of the post-Vietnam War era. They liked their wars to be won. They liked them to be over. They liked the troops to be home, out of harm's way. In addition, what I learned is that the groups that were ready to abandon the president were the predictable groups. The liberals who were supporting him, the Democrats who were supporting him, but also the suburban voters, the independents, the moderates, they would abandon him as well. Well, the president's numbers stayed high, although they started to erode with each passing month. Not unlike that big bounce of the rubber ball. It will last a whole lot longer. And so, actually, by the week before, the United States actually went to war in Iraq, the president was at 51% positive and 47% negative. Then he got the second bounce of the rubber ball. We went to war. The war on the ground was working. We were in the so-called mission accomplished phase. And the president's numbers this time shot up the same way that that second bounce of the rubber ball will shoot up. But this time, the president's numbers were at 69%, from 86 to 69. And just as that second bounce of the rubber ball won't last as long as the first bounce, these numbers lasted for the president about 7 weeks. Because by the third or fourth week of May 2003, we went to war in the middle of March 2003, the president was right back down to 50-50. It was astounding. And I wondered, I didn't understand, why did he not take the opportunity to reach out to the center, build that majority governing coalition while he had had the goodwill after 9/11 and certainly when the war began? Why was there not a broadly appealing domestic program? This president was still pretty much consolidating his conservative base. Gutsy guy. He went into the November elections back in 2002, and campaigned where presidents normally don't campaign, and he made a difference. But he spent all of the summer and all of the fall of 2003 at 50-50, 48-48. Just as many not liking him as liking him. It was just astounding to me. Then December 15th happened. December 15th, Sunday morning, everybody remembers that, Saddam Hussein is captured. And that's the third bounce of the rubber ball. But this time, the president's numbers, like that third bounce of the rubber ball, only went to 56%. And went to 56%, but like that third bounce of the rubber ball, it didn't last very long. Because by the time we started polling again, we annoy people about 340 days out of the year. We call them at home. You don't want to be called at home. Are you very happy, somewhat unhappy, or not happy at all? The routine. Incidentally, my youngest son graduates from college next Sunday. I don't care if he answers the phone anymore or not. I'm all set. I've paid my last tuition bill. But something happened in early January when we started polling again, and we found the president was back down to 50-50. But not only that, we had been polling all year long, all 2003, Democrats. And we asked Democrats some key questions. Number one, do you think that a Democrat can beat George W. Bush? All year long, 65 to 70% of the Democrats we polled in Iowa, in New Hampshire, and in South Carolina, all told us, no, a Democrat cannot beat George W. Bush. What kind of candidate do you want? Somebody who stands up for what he believes, or somebody who can beat George W. Bush? By far and away, they said, give us the candidate that stands up for what he believes. And the man of the hour, the second half of 2003, was Howard Dean. If we're going down in a blaze of glory, is what Democrats were saying. But after January 1st, and I don't know what happened because we didn't poll during that 2-week period around Christmas and right before New Year's. That's when we stopped. We had to pick it up again. President's numbers were back down to 50-50, and now we started polling in Iowa, and now 2/3 of the Democrats in Iowa are saying, yes, a Democrat can beat George W. Bush. Who do you want? Someone who can beat George W. Bush. And some pundits have called it the Zogby bounce. And it really wasn't. I'm just the messenger. We were doing daily tracking for NBC News and Reuters. And every day, Dean's numbers leading up to the Iowa caucuses were going down. A point. 2 points. And every day, John Kerry was going from 10 to 11 to 12. It's like watching paint dry. 13, 14. And at a point where they converged, I remember I was on the Today Show, and I said, I'm watching tomorrow. Tomorrow's going to be very important. Dean goes down and Kerry goes up. This could be all over, which won the total enmity of Howard Dean. He will never talk to me again as long as I live. Bottom line is that's what happened. That's what voters selected. That's what they wanted. They wanted somebody who could win. And the man of the moment, the only guy left, it wasn't Al Sharpton's year. you know. Those Joe Lieberman, Wesley Clark, empty suit, you know. It was going to be John Kerry or John Edwards, and it was John Kerry. But it was really a very strange election in the final analysis. And everywhere I turn, every way I look, what I see is that in the final moments of the campaign, where we were doing focus groups in all of the battleground states among undecided voters, the handful that were left, we did 2 detailed polls among undecided voters, like finding a needle in a haystack. And every poll we did, every focus group we did, the undecided said, we don't like George W. Bush. We don't like the war. But we can't get our arms around John Kerry. There's something there that's blocking us. And so, ultimately, the president won in really, I think, a very, very strange kind of campaign. Before anyone dismisses either candidate, understand that the one good fallout from this election, this Armageddon election, is that in 2000, approximately 50 million voters voted for George W. Bush, and approximately 50 million voters voted for John Kerry. Well, this time around, almost 60 million voted for George W. Bush, and about 57 million voted for John Kerry. You had an enormous, by American standards, voter turnout. So where do we go from here? This is a turning point week in an Armageddon nation where one side doesn't accept the legitimacy of the other side. Wither the John Bolton nomination. Too close to call. Conservative pundits predict he'll make it, but if he makes it, I don't want to date myself here, it won't be by a hair, it'll be by a frizzy. That's a split end, if you remember the old Tony commercials. Wither personal accounts. I think the president probably loses personal savings accounts, but I think he wins on Social Security just by having raised the third rail issue and showing the courage to do it. And then finally, the so-called nuclear option. Will the Senate preserve the right of minority senators to filibuster against presidential judicial nominees? It looks like we're in an 11th hour negotiating period with Senator Chuck Hagel as the chief negotiator trying to come up with some sort of solution. But it's those 3 issues that I think more than anything else speak to the polarization that's in Washington, D.C., and the polarization that's in the nation. There just is no effort on the part of the leaders at the top to seek a broader governing coalition or a consensus. And in a sad fallout, if you've ever read Man of the House by Tip O'Neill, for example, or read some of the books, The Power Game by Hedrick Smith, or some of the biographies of some of the key players just over the last 25, 30 years in American politics, you realize that George McGovern and Barry Goldwater used to play racquetball with each other once a week. In the House, not only do they not talk to each other, they don't know each other's names because they don't have to anymore. It's all about the caucus. And that's spread to the United States Senate, the so-called gentlemen's and gentle ladies club, where the level of partisanship has reached the kind of proportions that you only saw really in the years leading up to the Civil War in the 1850s, when Preston Brooks from South Carolina clubbed Charles Sumner in the head because he didn't like what he was saying. We haven't had violence yet take place, but it's nasty out there. And so that's my picture of an Armageddon nation following an Armageddon election. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I think you answered this by an earlier comment, but I wanted to know what effect, if any, you thought that the Swift Vote group had on this election.
I think it was enormous. I think it didn't have to be, but it was. What amazed me is that the Democrats going in, that the Democrats who were handling the campaign, and there were many of them, legions of people handling the Kerry campaign, all prepared to take credit if Kerry won, I might add. They were saying, we're not going to do what Dukakis did. Dukakis took a 2-week vacation after the Democratic convention, partially because he didn't have enough money, and then also decided to take the high road and not answer, some of the very negatives. Well, Kerry ultimately did the same thing, but no one really understood the reason. He had lots and lots of money. That's still not an issue. He still has lots and lots of money. That was never the issue. And the notion of taking the high road at that point was just silly because the nation was just so hostile. U.S. News and World Report did a piece ultimately a week before the election that showed neighbors pulling lawn signs down from the lawns of neighbors and families not talking to each other over Kerry versus Bush. Bottom line is that the Swift Boat veterans served to define John Kerry and neutralize any possible goodwill that he might have gotten from the Democratic convention. Now, he didn't get much. He went into the convention leading 48-45 over Bush. He got out of the convention leading 48-43. Bush went down a couple of points. Those 2 points went into the undecided column. So there wasn't goodwill, but any goodwill that he might have accrued, extra goodwill he might have accrued from the convention, he lost. And then, of course, from there, Bush went into his convention and did the #1 job that he had to do. He went into the convention with only the support of about 80% of his own Republicans. And he left the convention with over 90%, 91% of Republican support, which is what he needed to win the election.
Refer at all to the minority vote. And goes without saying that I'm particularly interested in the Latino vote. Aside from the Cuban Americans that always vote Republican, how do you see the Latino vote as a swing vote in the future?
This is a long answer, okay? First of all, the Latino vote is growing exponentially. In 1996, and it was about 5% of the vote nationally. It grew to about 6% of the vote nationally in 2000. It was upwards almost 9% of the vote, a little bit more than even I thought. I thought it was going to be about 8. It was 9%, but 9% of a much larger pie. See, 60 million for Bush, 57 million. So almost 9% of that was just huge. Now, where do Latinos stand? I've done a lot of focus groups and a lot of polls among American Hispanics. And essentially, the critical mass of Latinos are conservative on social issues. And they are liberal on government and government spending issues. And interestingly, what they told us in 1999, 2000, 2001, even 2002, even the conservative ones told us, Prop 187, we like where the Republicans are, but we can't push the lever for the elephant. Well, since that time, you had Latinos vote for Mike Bloomberg. He split the vote in New York City. And George Pataki in 2002. That was 2001 for Bloomberg, 2002 for Pataki in New York. And then in 2004, of course, it was or 2003, I'm sorry, Arnold Schwarzenegger got a big Latino vote. The ice had been broken. It was acceptable to vote Republican. The exit polls came in on Election Day showing 44% of the Latino vote went to George W. Bush. It did not. No one has been able to duplicate that number. They readjusted the exit polls, and I have to admit many of the exit polling data is almost worthless, unfortunately. But they adjusted it down to 40%. Frankly, my polls show that Bush got about 38% of the Latino vote. But it was 35% in 2000 of a much smaller pie. 38% of a much larger pie was extremely significant. What's the future of the Latino vote? It will just continue to grow exponentially. And the message for Democrats is talking in Espanol is not enough. That just doesn't cut it. You can't just take advantage of minority voters, because I'll tell you, you're just starting in a much smaller way, starting to see younger African-American voters not registering Democrat, not registering Republican, but not registering Democrat, going independent. And so it's going to be make for a very, very interesting voting dynamic over the next few years.
You have to talk about Hillary Clinton.
I do. Let me establish my credentials. July 1st, 1999, top of the op-ed page of the New York Times. Op-ed by me. Wrong state, wrong time. How she couldn't win in New York State.
I wish I'd have known you that. I won a lot of money.
Basically, what I laid out was the Bobby Kennedy formula, and how Bobby Kennedy won by losing every upstate New York county except Albany County, and just winning in New York City at a time when New York City was about 40% of the total vote. New York City is about 30% of the total vote. Upstate is much larger. What I didn't know then, but I learned during the campaign, she is the smartest person in the room. She wants it more than anybody else. She will go to any lengths to win. She was in Batavia, population 12,000, 7 times. She was in Binghamton. She was in Utica. She was in every small town and village throughout the entire campaign. On July 4th of 2000, she marched in the Lowville, North Country, Independence Day parade, and then went down to New York City. She became the local girl, and Rick Lazio became the carpetbagger. And so the scenario that I see from that is that she'll serve 2 terms as president, then 1 term as chairman of the Federal Reserve, and then she'll convert to Catholicism and live her life out as Pope.
This might be right.
Do not, if you're thinking of betting against her, do not bet against her. And frankly, inside track for the Democratic nomination, and anyone who thinks that she'll be a pushover. See, she walks in, whether it's New York or the nation, with 33% of the voters absolutely, unequivocally hating her guts. She has a 61% approval rating in New York. You can't possibly get any better than that when you have 33% who hate your guts. There's nobody left. And so basically she takes all those somewhat unfavorables and makes them somewhat favorables. She wins.
In the back. I certainly don't want to disagree with sort of your characterization of the partisan divide in Washington or anything like that. At the same time, it seems like the policy divide between Democrats and Republicans tend to be much smaller these days. Harry and Edwards voted for the Patriot Act, the war in Iraq, and okay, I would have done it slightly differently. I mean, Bush has this big tax cut that cuts the marginal rate from 39 to 35. I mean, compared to like Reagan and Carter, where you had just basic fundamental disagreements, it seems like things are a lot smaller today. I mean, do you think that?
It's a very good question, yeah. So the turf then is fought over the social issues. And the social issues then dominate if not the discussion, then at least the mindset of people. And so the number one divisive issue, the issue that created really where we're at today, is the war in Iraq. And clearly, in that instance, and you're absolutely correct, this will hold true for 2008 as well, there isn't a Democrat who can run as an anti-war candidate. Frankly, Kerry probably would have had a better chance of winning had he not voted for the war in Iraq, because that's what his base wanted. And in an election where you were just fighting the base, he never quite gave his base enough. But no, I think you're absolutely correct. And frankly, I also think that at a moment's notice, good leadership can recreate that center again, which is vital. I think I'm learning with each passing day that it's vital.
From your experience, tell us a little bit about the magic of the trend versus reversion to the mean. You talked about a couple of different items here: religion, gun control, married in which state. Which trends or issues in your business do you see the trend has more power and clout, or do you see these issues and trends become reversion to the mean?
I hope I understand you correctly. We deal in two things, two sets of two things. One I've already alluded to. We poll attitudes. I mean, what's your attitude towards auto emission standards being raised from such and such and such and such? You ask a voter that and say, tell me, say it again slowly. Then I think you want me to say I agree. I agree then. So we deal in fleeting attitudes. We also deal, though, if I attach those auto emission standards to core values, do you have a choice? Do you have, can you enhance the environment? If we go that environmental route, will it destroy jobs? Those are values kinds of things. Will it put some companies out of business because they can't compete? We deal with attitudes and we deal with values. That's one level. The values are what I watch. The other set that I look at are majorities versus intensities. Now, I can have 55% who say I support this and 40% say I oppose. So what? Big deal. It's not even on the radar screen. But if I see that among the 45% that oppose, more than half of them say, I am militantly opposed, strenuously opposed. This is the issue that I'm going to vote on in this election. The intensity factor is with the minority there instead of the majority. We're seeing something happen. It's appropriate we talk about it here in Texas, of all things. You are seeing a slow and steady shift away from support for the death penalty in the United States. Going back to 1993, late 93, early 94, the death penalty and crime became the number one issue in the country. And for the first time, rather than seeing 48% support and 45% opposed, numbers that just sort of are wishy-washy, we started to see 69% support the death penalty. We started to see 21% tell us that's the issue I'm going to vote on. That's what moved the nation, the intensity factor. Today, just in polling Catholics alone, we've gone from 66% of Catholics who support the death penalty to 48. But Those who say I'm very opposed outnumber 3-1 those who say I'm very supportive. It's kind of like the abortion issue. Abortion is roughly at equilibrium. 20% are pro-choice under all circumstances. 20% are pro-life, all circumstances. And then there are the three gray areas. Abortion but without government funding, no abortion except if the mother's health is endangered, those sorts of things. That middle is what moves, and it moves on the basis of a cataclysmic event. In 1973, the cataclysmic event was Roe v. Wade, and shifted intensity to the pro-life side. In 1998, I was tracking 10 states with very tight U.S. Senate elections, and liberals in all of those states were saying, I may not vote. Chuck Schumer, Harry Reid, John Edwards, these aren't the kind of guys I want to vote for. October 17th, 1998, Barnett Sleepian, OBGYN outside of Niagara Falls, New York, who performed abortions, is shot in his home. The intensity went way over to the pro-choice side. Pro-choice voters came out in huge numbers. All those Democrats were elected. We get into the early part of this century and millennium, and the intensity is back on the pro-life side. Partial birth or late-term abortions has shifted. Now, Rehnquist retires or passes away. There's an opening on the Supreme Court with one of the conservative judges leaving. Watch the intensity factor shift to the pro-choice side. Does that help in any way answer your question? Good, because that's all I know about anything.
Back in the last row.
I just need some clarification. You said earlier that this is a turning point week,
Yes.
and you also said that Bush loses personal savings accounts, but he wins on Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
Am I wrong when I say that Bush has pretty much said that PSAs are like the heart of his Social Security program? So how does he win on that?
Yeah, because I think what he's doing is he's providing himself some negotiating leverage by raising that issue, raising the bar so high, unless I'm giving him more credit than he deserves. We are now talking as kind of centrist reforms, talking about indexing Social Security to inflation. Now talking about raising the retirement age. You couldn't talk about those. Now Democrats are willing to talk about that in order to defeat personal savings accounts. So unless I'm giving him more credit than he deserves, I think, number one, he gets a lot of credit historically for raising the third rail issue. And number two, I think he gets a lot of credit because there will be some sort of Social Security reform. And for that, I'm not wearing a hat, but my hat's off to him. I also think, however, that the president made a serious mistake on personal savings accounts. By framing it as part of the Social Security crisis, he came out of the chute the wrong way. I've said on many occasions and have been quoted as saying, Paul Revere did not ride through the streets of Boston saying the British are coming in 37 years. People don't think in terms of 37 years. They think in terms of today. Thank you. A little belated laughter, but I appreciate it anyway.
Back in the last row.
You mentioned you had some interesting global data, particularly as it pertains to the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Would you share that?
Yeah. We have, one of the signs to me of a country ready for democratic change or moving towards democratic change, that it's in the air, is when I can go in and do my job. And every time I go into Saudi Arabia, I'm able to push the envelope further and further and further. We have asked about the proper role of clergy in politics and government. We have asked a number of personal questions about religion, and at the same time we've asked about attitudes towards Osama bin Laden and attitudes towards terrorism and so on. And so here, in a nutshell, is what we have discovered. And I think this is very, very important. We did some polling in early 2002. Basically, the message was to oversimplify. Number one, they love us. They hate our policy. Continue the policy and they won't love us anymore. Number two, unlike anything else that I had ever read, including the famous Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, who suggests that there are all these young people who just are born saying, oh, we hate the United States. How can we hate them more today? Contrary to that, 18 to 30-year-olds were the most favorably inclined toward the United States of any other age cohort. I think a lot of that, forgive my bluntness, got shot to hell with the war in Iraq. And at the same time, I think it also got shot to hell with the president's embrace of Ariel Sharon. You've got to know what Ariel Sharon means to Arabs and to Palestinians. And so essentially what we found was that by the next year, all the numbers went down. They just didn't like us anymore. Now, we have started to rebound back nowhere near where we were in 2002. We asked questions about, in each of the 3 years, are you favorable, unfavorable, on a scale towards American freedom and democracy, the American people, American-made products, and so on. And so it started to bounce back. It started to bounce back just a tad among younger people. But we also asked these questions that I think are some of the most important polling we've ever done. Have you ever been to the United States? Do you have family that's been to the United States? Would you like to visit the United States? Would you like to learn more about the United States? In each case, if you take those who said yes on all of those, they are anywhere from 25 to 28 points more favorable than those who said no on each of those counts. So here we are, really at a turning point when it comes to student visas and work-related visas. Homeland Security has got to do its job, but it's got to do its job well. Every day we are not bringing people over here and not sending people over there is a day where there are huge missed opportunities. That's just some of it. We, in Lebanon, we, not surprisingly, have found that Maronite Christians are from Neptune and Shia Muslims are from Venus. And basically there are fundamental differences. Shia Muslims blame Israel and the United States for murdering Rafiq Hariri. The Maronites blame Syria. I mean, just night and day. However, there are points where they do come together on some things.
7 o'clock.
I'm just getting warmed up, so.
Here's what we're going to do. I've got to go. And anyone who wants to join me may join me, but Mr. Zogby's having a good time, and so are you, so let it go on for another 15 minutes. Hey, that was great.
Yes.
In view of the increasing economic disparity among our people, how do you explain the lack of an economic interest motivating voters?
It's a huge interest. And when we ask voters, it's the number one issue. It was the number one issue that they told us right through the election. There's an element of sophistication, which is, what are you going to do about it? And they didn't really see, any thoughtful solutions coming from either side. And when it came to the choice of voting for Kerry on the economy or voting against Kerry on the war on terrorism, the war on terrorism trumped. I am not a believer that moral issues dominated this election. The way the exit polls were framed, they asked which of these was a top issue and why you cast your vote today. And listed as the 7th choice was morality/moral issues. Nothing else and no opportunity to say other. Moral issues then became the answer for everybody who didn't say the war, the economy, the war on terrorism, healthcare, and it just became the great dump all. We did a post-election survey interactively and accurately among 25,000 voters. And again, moral issues did not come in the, it came down around 8th, 9th, 10th every time. However, when we asked voters, what was the #1 moral issue in this election? By far and away, the #1 choice at 43% was the war in Iraq. And among those, over 90% opposed the war. The #2 issue, morally, at 12% was abortion. The #3 issue at 11% was poverty. And so I'm more inclined to think that that's ultimately what happened. Now, there were indeed voters who helped give shape to this election who did vote on moral issues. It didn't take much to change, an election from being a 1-point election to a 2.5 or 3-point election. But I mean, it was not the overriding dominant issue that dominated the nation.
Did you see any difference between red and blue states with regard to attitudes toward the future of America?
Only in this regard, and I looked at that more along the lines of age, but and foreign policy, you have the red states dominated, and we've since done polling on the new red states as well. Attitudes, foreign policy attitudes dominated by the notion of American hegemony and American sovereignty versus the blue states that tend to be much more multilateral. And that included not only overall, but in terms of Kyoto and the World Court and the United Nations and so on. Yes.
The Mexican border of the United States is always great contention, and we've had Commissioner Castillo who said we should build a fence, and he was thrown out immediately. But what do you think the future holds for that relationship with respect to polling and Indian occupation?
We've had some really interesting polling. In fact, we just had some out last week that Lou Dobbs reported on because he liked the findings. But, essentially, in a time where there is economic anxiety, xenophobia trumps. And so by far and away, when you combine the term illegal with the term alien or illegal with immigration, it conjures up all sorts of negatives, including people taking jobs away from Americans and so on. A lot of it depends on how the issue is framed. And the consensus point is that illegal aliens take away American jobs. Illegal aliens are responsible for crime. Illegal aliens are here unfairly. Illegal aliens are breaking the rules. Hence, we need more local law enforcement, more federal law enforcement, more blah, blah, blah. The reality is that when it's framed in a more nuanced way, Americans support the concept of immigration. They also support the concept of being fair to people, if you understand from whence they came. But in the objective, neutral polling that's been done, Americans do not want a porous border. And of course, the extra added dimension to that is Homeland Security these days. Back there.
Have you done any polling about Tom DeLay?
I have. I've done it for the Houston Chronicle, in fact, and he is vulnerable. Now, by virtue of his numbers, he is vulnerable. When an incumbent is polling under 50%, there's always a vulnerability factor. DeLay is actually, on a job description, is at 39%. He's less than 40% when people ask if he deserves to be reelected or it's time for somebody new. Fact of the matter is, though, that there is that vulnerability. Now, The Democrats have to settle on one candidate, and of course there's a candidate that's taking shape. There will be lots of money spent. It will suck all the oxygen and all of the airwaves right out. Unbelievable record numbers of money because delay can raise it. That's how I got in trouble, right? Okay. And the Democrats are just going to raise it because he is Diablo, the guy to beat this time around. Prediction, don't count him out, but he is vulnerable. I can't say that, but he. Okay. Ward is telling me it's time to go. Okay, on that comment. One more question. Go ahead.
Did you perform?
The lady who laughed at my joke. Thank you.
Belated.
Yes.
Did you do any polling about the effects of the redistricting and as far as?
No. That gets into stuff that's way over people's heads, and they don't really pay attention to their credit, I think, frankly.
I asked you about Hillary. I want to ask you, considering the power structure of the Republican Party, can Rudy Giuliani be the nominee?
No. But that's not a prediction. That's just offering a strong suggestion. No, he can't. I know Rudy, and I've worked for Rudy and respect Rudy. And I think, in all honesty, I would rather be God than President of the United States. And Rudy is just a tad under God on the pyramid right now. He's just got such a great name and a great reputation. As soon as he steps into the fray, does he really want to be battered and badgered and Carricked? What's that guy's name? How soon they forget. Bernard Carricked to death. No, I don't think so. Thank you, everybody. This is fun.